Well, thanks for coming, everyone. About 2 or 3 months ago, Germany's Europe minister, one Michael Roth, suddenly broke with diplomatic niceties and gave vent to his frustration about Brexit, which he described, quote, as a big shit show, being run by British politicians who were born with silver spoons in their mouths, who went to private schools and elite universities, making decisions, the consequences of which they will not personally suffer. And there's probably quite a big chunk of the British population, and possibly quite a big chunk of this room, that have a certain sympathy with that kind of feeling. But what I want to insist on is that beneath the shambles, the paralysis, the obsessions, the seemingly intractable and at times obscure arguments, and actually the worrying divisions we see even amongst working class people and the left, what's taking place, we have to grasp, is a very deep crisis of the Tory Party, of the parliamentary and political system, of the whole establishment, indeed of the whole ruling class in Britain. And we have to grasp the sheer scale of that and think through what it means. In other words, the process of Britain leaving the EU, Brexit, as it reorganises Britain's relationship with its biggest trading bloc, the EU, is simultaneously at the same time disorganising British politics, most obviously in the Tory Party, but as I'll also go on to talk about, and as we're again acutely aware of, also threatening to cut a swathe through the Labour Party, and I think represents a very serious danger to Jeremy Corbyn, his leadership and its prospects, the way things are going. And also, and I think this is one of the most difficult aspects of Brexit, as I said, it's divided the working class, it's divided the left. And these are very, very difficult problems in some ways to have to address. And I want to try and understand in this meeting how we can respond, not just so that we keep our heads in this process, but also how the left can try to take the initiative around the Brexit crisis and shape events in our favour, because it represents a crisis and a threat, but also a serious opportunity for the left, one that at the minute is too often being allowed to pass by. Now, one measure of the scale of the Brexit crisis can be seen in last month's elections to the European Parliament in Britain, which of course were never supposed to take place, because what they show is something really quite dramatic. And just to put it in context, at the last general election in 2017, which you'll remember, everybody remembers it, because this is when Theresa May lost her majority and so on. But actually, in that election, where Labour gained 3.5 million votes, thanks to the kind of radical insurgent position that Corbyn took, the Tory Party, by promising to deliver Brexit, actually added 2 million votes. And the combination of this meant that in that election, a trend that we'd seen for decades, which was that fewer and fewer people voting for the two main parties, Labour and Tories. You know, in the immediate post-war years, we get 80-90% of the vote. There'd been a long-term decline in that process, to the point when I think in 2010, about 1 in 3 people voted for other parties. 2 years ago, in 2017, we saw a sharp reassertion of the two-party system, where the combined Labour and Tory vote went up to about 82%. 82%. Just flick forward 2 years to May, to the European elections. Very, very different picture. The combined Labour and Tory vote in the European elections in May was 22%, about a quarter. With, of course, Nigel Farage's 6-week-old Brexit party worryingly topping the polls. We also saw a revival of the Lib Dem vote and a revival of the Green vote, partly, I think, because of the climate protests, and also because I think a layer of people wanted to vote for a Remain party that wasn't the Lib Dems. So it's a very, very different picture. Now, I want to focus on the Tories for the moment. I'll come back to Labour. The Tory party got 8.8% of the vote in this election. I mean, I've seen some people say this is their worst result since 1832. This isn't actually true. I looked. They got 13% in 1832. I mean, you had to be a major property owner or under the influence of property to vote. Put that aside. It's actually, I think, their worst vote since 1841, in the middle of the Great Corn Laws crisis under Robert Peel, which is not insignificant. Now, you know, and they came fifth. To put it another way, I hadn't thought of this until I saw a very interesting article by John Molyneux, who's speaking here this weekend at Marxism. In May, the number of people in Britain who were entitled to vote in the European elections in Britain was something of the order of 46.5 million. How many of them chose to utilise that opportunity to show their support for the governing party in Britain? This is a question and answer bit. Anybody? Any bids? How many? Sorry. 1.5 million. 1.5 million out of 46.5 million chose to vote for the governing party. The Tory Party, when I was born in 1968, the Tory Party had 1.5 million members. This is how many voters it got time. Now, this is really quite staggering. Now, look, there are caveats. The European election is not the same as a general election, and it won't be the same picture. There's a very low turnout. People don't see it as about who runs the country. It's an opportunity to protest. It doesn't not seen as matter. And probably the most committed to either their party or to remain or leave chose to vote. Nonetheless, this is quite a remarkable situation for the Tory party to face. In other words, that promissory note that Theresa May gave in 2017 that she would deliver Brexit, that allowed them to pull a section of UKIP's vote towards them, is now being called into question. Their inability to deliver Brexit, their turmoil, their division, their directionless, is creating a first-rate crisis. May's failure to get her EU withdrawal agreement through Parliament, defeated 3 times, unprecedented. Some of us remember times when governments lost motions on their central policy, they actually resigned. That seems like a different era. Apparently Parliament doesn't seem to matter. She's been forced out, particularly by the intransigence of the Tory right, and actually the intransigence of hard Remainers who won't accept any compromise either in Parliament. And we now have a situation where, because of Farage's victory in May, it's almost certain that Boris Johnson, who's prepared to embrace a no-deal option as a way of claiming this will bring the EU to better negotiate and so on, will become the Tory party leader. I say almost because I suspect there's only one thing that can stop Boris Johnson becoming Tory party leader, which is Boris Johnson, which is why they're very, very carefully shielding him from any public appearances. How this will work when you're Prime Minister, I'm not entirely sure. In fact, the very words Boris Johnson, I think, are a reflection of the sort of humbling weakness of the Tory party in its contemporary era. I have to say, though, little else seems certain. I mean, if Johnson does become Tory leader, what changes? It's the same Parliament. It's the same problem. There's probably no majority for any position inside Parliament. I think Johnson's claims that he can somehow, unlike May, bring the EU to open a renegotiation, despite the fact that they constantly say that they will not, is very, very unclear how this will solve any of the problems. And Johnson, and this is extraordinary, I don't know if people caught this, Johnson refuses to rule out as a way of dealing with the fact that there isn't a parliamentary majority for a no deal Brexit, of proroguing Parliament. Now that's one of those obscure words, but it's just a posh word for saying suspending Parliament. In other words, that he would push through a deal without the support of Parliament. I mean, quite an extraordinary and quite a dangerous thing, both for our side, that parliamentary democracy can be pushed aside, but also for a party that claims, to be a parliamentary party, constitutional party, to secure the consent of the British people. This is a dangerous, dangerous game to be playing. Now, what I want to stress is beneath what's going on inside the parliamentary Tory party, beneath Johnson's posturing and so on and so forth, is a deeper problem. And the way I would put it like this is that the historic role of the Tory party, which it has performed with considerable success for well over a century, is to defend, secure popular support, or at least a degree of popular support and consent for, and promote the interests of British capitalism. That's its central governing purpose, above and beyond individual parliamentary careers and so on. And yet we have a situation where the Tory Party's commitment to Brexit, which is becoming on an ever harder basis as we move from May to Johnson, is not the policy of the core of the British capitalist class. I don't mean every individual capitalist. It's not true, I think, that big capital and the big banks, those who trade internationally, have international supply chains, look to wider international markets and so on, are split over the question. The vast, vast majority, if you were to just say to them what do they want, it would be to stay inside the European Union. That's the best way it can see of continuing to secure its profits and stability and so on and so forth. So I think what we're probably seeing is a progressive erosion of the confidence of the core of the British capitalist class in its own party, the Tory Party. First of all, David Cameron says, we will secure the long-term stability of Britain's relationship with the EU. We will shoot UKIP's fox, strike out the Tory Eurosceptics. I'll call a referendum and we'll settle this question. Didn't work out so well. Then Theresa May, a Remainer turned Brexiter, calls a snap general election to secure a big parliamentary democracy against this unelectable chap Corbyn, in order to navigate Brexit through Parliament and be able to face down the hard Tory right and so on. Again, a complete miscalculation and utter disaster for them. You then have a situation where May tries to pursue a deal which doesn't involve staying in the single market or the customs union, which is again what Capital would prefer. But Capital puts huge pressure on her to otherwise compromise and try and stick with as much of the EU as possible. It's a compromise. You know, the head of the CBI says, this isn't our deal, but we'll accept it. The problem is she cannot get it through Parliament. This is the situation we're facing. And now, you know, you have probably the single worst option that British capitalism can see is a no-deal Brexit, a kind of disorganised break, because it's unpredictable, it could do damage to their supply chains and so on and so forth. And yet that's increasingly what they're facing with Johnson embracing it. The Financial Times did a survey of you know, big city bosses and so on, and essentially about Johnson. What's their attitude to Johnson? Their attitude to Johnson essentially veers from distrust to contempt. One of them said, the only good thing about Johnson is he's such an opportunist, maybe he'll change his mind again and come back to the kind of position. It's not the biggest recommendation, is it? And they haven't forgotten Johnson's infamous comment when asked about, well, what about the interests of business, Boris, with your hard Brexit? Fuck business. I mean, Matt Hancock, who stood for the complete nobody, you know, and it's telling that he was pretty quickly pushed out, he stood on the platform of fuck business, right? I was trying to defend the historic alignment of the Tory Party with big business. Now, in other words, what I'm describing is, yes, he doesn't, he's now switched to support Johnson, a man of complete principle, yeah. You know, some of us who've been around the Marxist left sometimes use shorthand, and we sometimes talk about the relationship between the party and the class. And usually we're talking about either the Labour Party or a revolutionary party like the Socialists and the working class movement. But there's also a relationship, as I've been describing, between their class and their party. And that relationship is currently in crisis. There is a crisis of political representation at the top of society. Or another way of putting this is not unconditionally, not completely, and perhaps not permanently, but at this moment, the establishment in Britain, the British ruling class, one of the oldest and most sophisticated anywhere in the world, has lost control of the political process. This is a deeply unstable situation that we have to grapple with. Now, that's why I think when people start invoking the great Corn Law crisis in the Tory Party in the 1840s that split them for a generation, the huge arguments and splits around the introductions of tariffs in the empire in the early 1900s as Britain faced competition from industrialising powers in Europe. And it's right to invoke this kind of comparable scale. The problem, however, is that rather than seize this opportunity to drive them out and for the left to seize the agenda, that at one and the same time we see this deep crisis gripping the Tory Party, we face a situation where Labour too is riven by tensions, divisions and arguments. And this, if you like, is a second dimension of the crisis because, again, for the ruling class, faced with a Tory party that can no longer deliver, you think, those of us remember, John Major's crisis-ridden government in the 1990s, you look to Plan B. And Plan B takes the form of a Labour Party that you can rely on. The problem is, at the minute, they don't have a Tony Blair, or a Gordon Brown, or even an Ed Miliband, who I think they could certainly live with. They have Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And this massively complicates the picture for them. And therefore, that's why we're seeing, aren't we, a really quite sustained... I mean, people talk about the problems, rightly, the problems that a Labour government would face in office from the establishment. At one point after the general election, even Labour politicians were talking about this, John McDonnell. They kind of seemed to shut down that debate. But it's not just future tense. There's already a massive and sustained counterattack, which I think is doing real damage, as I want to go on and explore. And at the forefront of this attack is a kind of tag team between the parliamentary Labour Party, or the right wing, ensconced in that, who don't represent a majority in the Labour Party, but are using their positions in Parliament to inflict constant attacks and damage, led by, well, I mean, Tom Watson seems to perform the role of a kind of militant shop steward for the sectional interests of the parliamentary Labour Party, with far more gusto than some of our union leaders pursue the defence of our side. A tag team between the Labour right and the media. And they pick up each other's claims and amplify each other's claims, constantly. And an aspect of this, of course, is the relentless claims that Labour is riddled with anti-Semitism, such that even to now say, to challenge that claim and say any individual cases may exist and should be dealt with, but Labour isn't institutionally anti-Semitic, which is what Chris Williams said, is now deemed anti-Semitic itself, and you too become a victim of the witch hunt. And I think there are too many retreats on this question. I mean, there was a Chakrabarti report, which 3 years ago, to deal with this, not a bad report itself. There was the new General Secretary of the Labour Party, Jenny Formby, will be more efficient. Hasn't stopped it at all. And crucially, if you remember last summer, the argument that Labour should accept all of the examples, it already accepted the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism, but all of the examples, which crucially include the claim that it's anti-Semitic to say that Israel is racist. And the argument, and actually the key force here was the union leaders, both the right-wing ones, GMB and USDAW, but also Unison and then crucially Unite, saying, let's just accept this and then we can move on. And we can talk about austerity. And again, I think too much of the Labour left falls into the same argument. If we just retreat, we can change the agenda. And each time, I mean, why would they change the agenda? It's working. Because it's not about actually seriously addressing the question of anti-Semitism. It's about an attack on Corbyn's leadership. And therefore it keeps on coming. And I have to say, if they now fail to restore the whip, the parliamentary whip, and fully reinstate Chris Williamson, I think this will deeply demoralise a whole other layer of Labour support, who will rightly say, if we can't defend someone like Chris Williamson, how are we going to stand up to the full force of the British ruling class if we get into office? These are very, very serious matters. And therefore, I think, put it this way, there's a witch hunt. The worst thing to do in a witch hunt is to retreat. They keep on coming. You have to face it down. And I don't think that's happened in any kind of serious way. And every time they do retreat, it emboldens the Labour right. I mean, it's a storm in a teacup. I mean, but I don't know if people saw it. In London yesterday, the front page of the Evening Standard was that Tom Watson was whipping up a campaign about a Labour MP in Lewisham called Ellie Reeves, who had signed Watson's petition to resuspend Chris Williamson, that she was facing a kind of bullying mob trying to drive her out. What was the truth? The truth, when you read the small print, was that a single member of her constituency Labour Party, entirely within their rights, whether you agree with it or not, but entirely within their democratic rights inside the Labour Party, wanted to put a motion of no confidence, which, by the way, has no constitutional force. And this is mob rule. Now, there'll be something else tomorrow, but the confidence of the Labour right, who were defeated in the open battles when it was, against Owen Smith and the election and the coup and so on, they have switched from frontal assault to knock out Corbyn to a kind of trench warfare of attrition, of grinding down his leadership. And again, they have some success on this. And it's not just, though, the Labour right and the media. There's also you get glimpses of the state machine's hostility to Corbyn. Senior civil servants briefing that Corbyn's too frail. We're always told the Queen is hardworking and, thank you, sprightly at 93, but Corbyn's too frail. Or, more sinister, the 4 members of Para 3rd Battalion who were using pictures of Corbyn for rifle practice, who we're now told none of them have been dismissed, 2 have been demoted. It's the same unit, by the way, where there's an allegation from a black paratrooper who was driven out that they not only racially harassed him, but decorated their barracks and so on with Nazi memorabilia and so on. You just get a glimpse of the core of the state machine and its hostility to something like Corbyn's project. And the problem, I think, is exacerbated by the fact that sections of the left, whether it's the question of the witch hunt over anti-Semitism, or, as we go on, I think, around the question of a second referendum, which I'll touch on now, go along with too much of this and make retreats. I mean, John Landsman, the unelected leader of Momentum, capitulating over Chris Williamson. Owen Jones also saying, yes, it's just better if he goes, and somehow we can... This is very dangerous, I think, very, very dangerous. Now, let's come back to the question of Brexit and Labour. There is clearly huge pressure building up, and I have to wonder whether it isn't going to break through, for Labour to shift its position and to openly embrace a campaign for a second referendum and to state that it will support a Remain position. In other words, to break with what's sometimes been called since the referendum Labour's position of strategic ambiguity, where Labour says it accepts Brexit, but on a basis of trying to stay in the customs union and the single market and so on, and to unite Leavers and Remainers along the line of opposition to austerity and inequality, which I think there's much going for. I'll come back to that again. I think, however, there's massive pressure on Corbyn to break from that. I personally think Corbyn is sort of fighting a rearguard action, as actually he did around the IHRA examples, but he's becoming increasingly isolated. I mean, the fact that John McDonnell seems to have broken ranks, how many people are still with him at the top? And actually, crucially, it's only the Unite Union, who I think have sometimes pulled Corbyn to the right on some questions like freedom of movement of Labour and Trident. At this point in time, I think are holding the line. But come the Labour Party conference, I'm not sure the line is going to hold. Now, I think this will be a big mistake. And people will have other views, possibly, in the room, and so we should debate these things. But I think it would be a huge mistake. I do not see how, for example, responding to Farage's victory in the European elections by Labour becoming a pro-Remain party will help in any way at all to win back any of those kind of votes. I think a second referendum, I mean, good God, the first referendum was pretty divisive, and the arguments since have often been very divisive, inside our unions, inside our families, inside the whole working class movement. I think a second referendum would be much, much worse, and would push, and it's the best possible thing that could happen to Nigel Farage. I think it will push another layer of people into saying you can't trust the establishment, you voted the wrong way last time, they want you to keep on voting till you vote the right way. It's a very, very dangerous development, in my view. I think what's required is not simply to hold the line on strategic ambiguity. I think what's required is strategic boldness. Labour has to go much more on the front foot around class questions. It's been too paralysed, too cautious. I think the spirit of radicalism that we saw at the high point of Corbynism in their general election in 2017 has been missing far too often. You see glimpses of it, but it's been missing far too often. There needs to be a real focus on class feeling in British society, which runs very deep and unites working class people. The fact that there are 14 million people living in poverty in Britain, 3.7 million of them children. Meanwhile, the richest 1,000, which is just the upper tip of the rich, the richest 1,000 families in Britain now have combined wealth of 771 billion. That figure has tripled since 2008 in the Great. There's been no crisis at the top. Meanwhile, we've had this most sustained austerity, probably since the Napoleonic period, in terms of working class people. You have to put class central, and it would certainly help if some of the union leaders at least thought Tories are in a mess, now's a good time to press a wage claim, and try to reshape the political agenda. In other words, a vision of Labour saying, as part of us leaving the EU, it won't just be a break from the EU, but it'd be part and parcel of a real sustained fight to create a completely different kind of society. The kind of vision that enthuse people in Labour's manifesto. And actually, within that, to put the argument, it would be easier to do this, it would be easier to renationalise, easier to break from PFI, easier to break from outsourcing if we're outside the EU's deeply embedded strictures on neoliberalism and support for the market. I'll give you a concrete example. People may have seen that in South Wales, in Bridgend, the Ford factory, which employs 1,700 people, but will have a big impact on the supply chains in an area South Wales has been hit heavily by losses in manufacturing jobs, well-paying jobs, and so on. You could take an approach. I mean, what's good is that Unite is saying it's going to ballot its members. It needs to be serious about this, and its vision needs to be a lot higher than simply getting a better redundancy package, which is what I fear it is, but a real fight to save those jobs for the future of that community and beyond. In the context of a strike, call a demonstration, get Jeremy Corbyn at the head of it. Thanks. The demand has to be to renationalise, or to nationalise the Ford. And I'll tell you what I would also say. If you say, we will now run this in the public interest, why do we need cars that pollute? Why don't we use the skills of those workers to produce things that can be part of a sustainable environmental solution around public transport and so on, with no loss of jobs, no loss of pay, no loss of conditions, and all those school students who have been walking out would have a completely different vision of the trade union movement and the Labour Party and so on. And you could electrify British politics and completely change the political agenda. You know, there are opportunities, but they're being let pass. Secondly, it has to be combined, I think, the Labour should say, we'll break from the EU and going to break on an internationalist and an anti-racist basis. I think this is fundamental. A lot of people who I would describe as left Remainers, who I would agree with on huge amounts, don't believe we should stay in Remain because they love the EU or completely, but there's that fear, isn't it, of the far right, of Farage and Johnson, the wider rise of the far right internationally. Now, it is of course right to say, but the far right is developing across the EU. It's an incubator, not a bulwark. That's true, but I'll tell you what would be really a decisive intervention. If Jeremy Corbyn stood up and said that when Britain leaves the EU, Labour's policy is that free movement of EU citizens will continue. Its current policy is to say it will end. Say it will continue, and then turn round to the leaders of the Remain camp, who paint themselves in progressive colours. Alistair Campbell, are you in favour of free movement? Tony Blair, Michael Heseltine, because they're not. You would split the Remain camp and pull a section of the left Remainers, give much more confidence that what was being offered was a vision of leaving that isn't Farage's, but of a different kind of society. And by the way, within that framework, you can also raise questions about the whole nature of the EU, Fortress Europe. I mean, we've talked many times at Marxism and other meetings about what's happening in the Mediterranean because of Fortress. But I'll tell you, the scale is staggering. The EU's response to 1 million people, which is a tiny portion of the 500 million people who live in the EU, it's not a crisis at all, coming from Syria and elsewhere in 2015, was to massively extend its presence in Africa. There's a fascinating documentary by Deutsche Welle, which is like the BBC World Service equivalent of Germany, called Europe's Borders in Africa, about the thousands, for instance, of German troops in Mali helping stop migrants get to the border to get across. An aspect of this, which I didn't know, but we should all know, is that includes funding for the military in Sudan, in particular the Rapid Support Forces, the old Janjaweed militia, who are the people that slaughtered over 100 protesters in the Sudanese revolution who encamped outside the military headquarters. The EU has its fingers in the blood of those people. And these arguments must be made, but can only be made on an internationalist basis. Otherwise, what we're seeing, I think, is that those two camps of Remain and Leave, both of which have reactionary leaderships, are in many ways pulling even more people to drop even their more critical elements and line up behind. This is a very dangerous situation. It seems to me that there is a law in British politics, if there's such a thing can exist, at least since the Scottish referendum, which is whoever makes an insurgent radical argument begins to set the political agenda. In the Scottish referendum, the fact that it became a movement, not just about the constitution, but a mass movement against austerity, war and racism, transformed the landscape in Scotland and came quite close to winning the referendum. At the minute, And I think you saw the same kind of thing in the general election. The problem is I think Labour is too paralysed, it's too becalmed, it's not offering a radical solution, and I think this is in danger of demoralising many activists. And that means the agenda has been set by Farage with his kind of fake anti-establishment radicalism, which hides his... Farage isn't simply a racist. I think he's increasingly accommodated to the kind of far-right worldview around the people like Trump and Salvini and so on. This is a very dangerous development. There has to be a return to that sense of insurgency. So 4 points to sum up, because I can see Despina's getting nervous. The SWP has argued, we argued to leave in the referendum. I think we're right to continue to argue, not simply to leave, but to a break from the EU on an internationalist class basis that makes no concessions over freedom of movement, no concessions over anti-racism, but has no truck with what is a neoliberal racist EU. It must still be made. That argument must still be made. We're for a general election, not a second referendum. This seems to me entirely possible. There could be a general election. There's a wing of the Tory Party that are threatening to show their loyalty to the ruling class rather than to the Tory Party by voting again. Who knows? But I'll tell you what, it's not enough just to call for a general election without mobilisations by our side, and I do think the union leaders have a culpability here, that can exploit that weakness and raise the price of the Tory Party still staying in office. It's harder to achieve that. I think that alongside this, and we can't just we can argue for it, it's not always possible just to summon it up. We have to continue to actively build an anti-racist and anti-fascist movement. The Brexit Party winning the EU elections is a terrible thing. The Brexit Party plus Tommy Robinson going into it would have been much more dangerous. And I think the campaign, particularly in the Northwest, the Tommy 2% doesn't quite speak for the working class, as he likes to claim, and all these kind of... it's a huge victory on that involved trade unionists, revolutionary socialists, Labour Party, and so on. And we have to continue to build such a movement now to face the new and dangerous challenge of Farage. There is a trap here. If the anti-racist movement is built on a stop Brexit basis, I think it will be very, very damaging. It will limit it, and it will say to people who voted leave, really, Farage, Johnson or Robinson are really the people you should identify with. This is a huge danger. And I think if Labour does retreat and eventually becomes a stop Brexit party, I think this will make this challenge harder. So we're going to have to keep on fighting to say you oppose Farage, whether you stood for leave or remain, you oppose him because he's a far-right racist who needs to be stopped. You have to have clarity about that. The final thing I want to say is that there is a movement that I think has the possibility of reshaping the political agenda in Britain, and we have to seize it. We have to absolutely... And that is the movement we've seen from the school students and Extinction Rebellion. And as people may be aware, on September the 20th, there is a call for a global climate strike. The people like Greta Thunberg are saying, come on, to the adults, it's time to join and show your support for the students. I think there is an opportunity in our workplaces to call meetings and say, what can we do about this? Can we get a walkout? I think in some places that is possible. In other places, a demonstration at lunchtime, some kind of symbol of solidarity in schools teaching about climate change and so on. But you have to start from saying, what can we achieve in our workplaces? If we can get walkouts, if we can demonstrate that workers' collective action can strengthen the climate movement, we will not only move forward in the fight to stop climate change, we will not only reshape the political agenda in Britain, I think it will provide an alternative to the kind of narrow right-wing debate that we're seeing about Brexit. Above all, we have to break from the kind of paralysis and spectating and passivity of just being gripped by this horror show at the top, and we need to act, and September the 20th is a golden opportunity to do so.
I'll try and keep it brief, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of Brexit and Corbyn on the campuses. I'm a student at Bristol Uni, and as you can imagine, Bristol as the city and the campus as well is very, very strongly pro-Remain, but they also, really support Corbyn. And I think it's kind of worth acknowledging that amongst people amongst my generation, I think arguments over the second referendum aren't kind of as tightly won as like people on the Remain side may think. a lot of my mates who are heavy Remain supporters still don't think that a second referendum is necessarily a good idea. And especially when you raise arguments about kind of the refugee crisis, especially with like Salvini in Italy, these are arguments that actually really chime with people amongst our young generation. So when you're talking to young kids on stalls or at the campuses, I don't think we should necessarily assume that they're always going to be Remain. I must admit that is still the majority, because a lot of people still believe the lies that they're fed from the top, that it's going to be much better for students and for young people and for the economy, blah blah blah, if we stay within the EU. But what I think is slightly more interesting is the kind of dual attitudes that people have got to Corbyn on the campuses. Like in Bristol, when we're doing a stall with those posters up and we say no to racism and then a poster next to it that says back Corbyn, every single time I get people coming up to me going, don't you think that's ironic when Corbyn's racist, blah blah blah. But then they also, these very same people are the same people who kind of turn to Corbyn and say he's got to save us from Brexit, which kind of, it not only shows you that it's definitely a witch hunt, and they don't really believe it, but it also shows you that there's a kind of section of the middle class that are absolutely, essentially deluded and convinced that if Corbyn backs a second referendum, Labour will win the next election. And it's as though they've kind of forgotten that the working classes in the north and around even exist. Like, they point to the gains made by the Lib Dems and the Greens as evidence to show that, if Corbyn backs a second referendum, of course he'll win the next election, because look at the gains they made. Whilst completely ignoring and not even acknowledging the fact that Farage and the Brexit Party swept the floor. And I just think it's an absolutely ridiculous kind of assumption to make that Labour will win the next election because the Greens and the Lib Dems did so well, when actually the Brexit Party did way better than anybody else. Like, even if you add up what the Greens and the Lib Dems got, it doesn't match what the Brexit Party got. And they genuinely believe it's the only way Labour will win the next election is if they back Remain. Whereas I'm of the persuasion that actually the only way, I don't think the Labour's going to get into government for the next couple of decades unless they actually support, a left-wing leave that I hope most of us in the room will want to see. Yeah.
Yes, I want to make three very quick points. I think first on the question of the referendum, the point is the Tory Party are on the brink of splitting and destroying themselves. The one thing that will save them is a second referendum, which will allow them to take the decision out of their hands, allow them to reunite, and if you get a Remain vote, which will probably be fairly narrow, it will then give them a perfect alibi for the future. It will mean that they can say, if we'd left the EU, this wouldn't have happened. If left the EU, that wouldn't have happened, and it's all Labour's fault. The second thing is to say that I'm not at all convinced that the no deal will be stopped by Tory Remainers. I think that much more importantly for them is stopping Corbyn, and most importantly, saving their seats. You look at all the people who hated Johnson who now lined up behind him. I'm convinced that they want to avoid an election at all costs. The third thing point I'm going to make is the amount of effort that has gone into attacking Corbyn from the media, from the BBC, from the Guardian, and there's been an enormous amount of credibility spent on out blatant lies, which many of the new young people who are attracted to Corbyn can see. And this is going to, in the longer run, massively cause a problem, I think, for the British ruling class.
Thank you.
Hello, I'll keep this brief as well. I'm a Labour Party member, and my worry is, as you've said, we've got Corbyn, my mentor, who was in the militant. He says we've been waiting 70 years for someone like this. However, the Labour Party is falling apart. I see it in my constituency. I see it when I go to regional. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who, having spoke to Corbyn, she was going to, they were going to put that left candidate up. She's just said that she's lost hope in Corbyn, and the Jewish community have lost hope in Corbyn. You've got John McDonnell that's not backstabbing Corbyn, but going away from Corbyn. You've got Emily Thornberry doing the same, trying to backstab him because she wants it. And I just think, unless he changes and really, really changes, which I don't think he will, I think Labour's really done. And I hate saying it because I don't want to say it, but I think it could also be time that we need a new left-wing leader, because I think they've done too much damage on Corbyn. I think a younger, fresher person who hasn't got the history, who they can't damage, might actually be better. And I hate saying that, but yeah, thank you.
There's one element in the crisis I think that Mark didn't mention, and if people had been following the commentators in The Guardian in the last couple of weeks, we noticed that they've actually cleared up the fact that the current political situation, as far as they're concerned, can lead to the breakup of the union, a tremendous threat to the union. No questions in the commentator like Martin Kettle that the union's a good thing. But it was based, I think, on a speech Gordon Brown made a few weeks ago, saying, the current Brexit crisis is a threat to the union. And I actually think there's some substance in that, because Scotland actually voted to remain, but it's been dragged out against its will. Don't get me wrong, I argued in Scotland, Scottish Left leave to act against the EU, but there's a question of democracy here. And when you get a situation when 64% of the Tory Party say they would rather see Scotland leaving than staying in the EU, you can see that the depth of the crisis and the current situation. So it's quite an important point, I think, that needs to be recognised. You would think in that situation that the SNP would push forward for a second independence referendum, but they certainly have been making gains out of it, and they've certainly been making arguments out of it. But the reality is that it's a contradictory situation, because the SNP in Scotland are more concerned about keeping Scottish business happy, and therefore they argue for the Remain position and support a second independence, support a second referendum on Brexit in priority to a Scottish independence referendum. That's the reality of the situation just now. That's the way that they're going. Even to the extent, I think, of joining in the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. They need part and parcel of the attacks from the right on Jeremy Corbyn to bolster their own position. And I think, as socialists, we have to keep arguing for Scottish independence up in Scotland, but in a way that unites the left around the issues and about fighting together, rather than joining in the attacks on Corbyn in the way the SNP have done. And it's, I think, to the extent that what they want to do is prove that they're safe for business in Scotland, rather than for a radical independent Scotland.
Thank you. Yes, thanks very much. I just wanted to come back on what the Labour Party member said, because I'm complete sympathy for the notion of electing a left-wing leader, and a left-wing Prime Minister, and I still have some hope and thoughts that Corbyn will become the next Prime Minister. However, the whole point is, it isn't really about a different personality. The reason he is so hated, he's got genuine roots. He started off in my trade union. I've been a nurse in the health service for over 30 years, and he was a worker for NUPE, and everything and all his principles are what they absolutely hate. So I think, as Mark quite rightly pointed out, it isn't about a future, how a left-leading Labour government would be treated. He's being treated by even his own party like that. And unfortunately, I think it is, the Socialist Workers' Party, of which I've been a member a long time, we haven't sort of changed our views on how we're going to get real change. It's in our interest to have somebody who says they'll tax the rich, who says they'll abolish student fees, but ultimately the way we will get change is by fighting ourselves. And I think we're going to hear at Marxism and at tonight's rally by brilliant people who have been through the process of being on strike, etc., for really, really winning demands over their pay. And there is no substitute for that, and that sort of changes the person themselves. I just wanted to say another thing in that 2-minute discussion, which might have gone out of control because everybody seemed to talk an awful lot. We were talking on this row about the Brexit vote, and when it first happened, the next morning I was texted by people who don't know me at all, assuming that I voted, pro-EU, and it's sort of been quite difficult to explain over the years why I haven't been, but one of the simplest arguments I always have is, when did David Cameron and I share any opinion? If he wants something, if it's in his interest and the big bosses, it's never in my interest. And I think Mark explained that very well at the beginning. Thanks.
Sean Lovely-Hackney, I agree entirely with the last speaker. Let's be absolutely categorically clear about this. A defeat for Corbyn and replacing him with any other prospective leader of the Labour Party would be a massive defeat for the whole of the left and would be the final capitulation to the right-wing attacks on him from inside the Labour Party and from the Tory Party. I also want to say that whilst I agree with the comrade at the back who talked about the self-interest of Tory MPs, we should not forget, and going back to what Mark said in the introduction, that doesn't alter the fact that the Tory Party is split. Leading Tory journalists, pro-Remain in the main I should say, have this to say, Max Hastings being one of them, have this to say about Johnson. He's unfit for national office because it seems he cares for no interest save his own fame and gratification. Now there is a core of Tories who are totally opposed to Johnson and all that he stands for, not just because of the question of character, but because they are part of the ruling class establishment that is wedded to the EU. Two very quick final points. The correlation between the pro-Remainers inside the Labour Party and the use of anti-Semitism to attack Corbyn is very, very significant. And the people using anti-Semitism in this false way are opening a door to people like Jeremy Hunt, who makes the obscene comparison between Corbyn's Labour Party and the horrors of Auschwitz. And the last point I want to make is this. When we're talking about the EU, Mark outlined some of the horrors of their existing policies. Not only are they in political crisis, witness the shenanigans this week, they are facing an impending economic crisis, but the level of racism that they espouse is beyond belief. Do not forget, they have funded the concentration camps in Libya that are now being bombed by one of the militias in Libya, and that the people in those camps who are dying are those desperate to escape from poverty and austerity throughout the whole of the continent of Africa. That is deliberate policy on the part of the EU, and we need to shout that from the rooftops to those who say that the EU is even remotely progressive.
Yes, I guess I wanted to come in as well on this question of Corbyn and what he represents, because I think, you know, the reason they're so afraid of him is precisely because he represents the kind of people in this room. You know, he represents socialists, he represents anti-racists, he represents a fight against austerity, a break from the status quo, a break from Blairism and all we've had for, you know, for the past 20 years and then the previous 20 years under the Tories. And I agree it would be a massive defeat if he had to step down. I also think it's worth this, you know, if you think back to when Corbyn got elected as leader, you know, when it was a shock to everyone and the media and the Labour right hadn't got their shit together yet, and everyone had to recognise what a fine, upstanding and morally unimpeachable man he is actually. And I think all of us who've worked with him know that. You can't think of a nicer person and someone who is, you know, is principled, etc. You know, if they can smear Jeremy Corbyn to the extent that they managed to do that, they can do that to absolutely anyone. And I don't think anyone he was replaced with would be able to, you know, get by without you know, I think it's been unbelievable, the level of the campaign, particularly the anti-Semitism stuff. You know, I never thought I would be on an anti-fascist demonstration, which I have been in the past couple of years, where they're chanting at us that we're racist, you know, because they're feeding off of the anti-Semitism witch hunt. I mean, it's a complete joke, really, but a very unfunny one, because it's really serious for the reasons people have said. I think that the things, you know, that I talk about in terms of what Corbyn represents for people, the reason he got elected, the reason there was that feeling of a real grassroots insurgent campaign around the general election in 2017, which again kind of boosted him again. But, you know, those are the things that frustrate me about Corbyn and the Labour left at the moment. You know, it's the fact that there isn't enough of that fight over austerity, there isn't enough of that fight against racism and so on. There's too much caving in. And I think that, you know, where Mark talked about the climate strike in September, you know, I think that's the kind of thing where all socialists, all activists, all trade unionists, all students, all climate activists need to be thinking, how do we physically make this happen? You know, in my workplace, in your street, in your school, whatever it is. How do you organise, and on all different levels? I mean, there's a really good, interesting report in the new issue of Socialist Review from a comrade in Switzerland about the women's strike that just took place there a couple of weeks ago. 500,000 people came out on strike. You know, striking is not a normal thing in Switzerland. And but what she talks about is the different degrees of activity that people got involved in. If they could strike, they struck. If they couldn't, they had a walkout. If they couldn't do that, they wore a ribbon. You know, there's all kinds of levels of things that people can do which still make you part of that big movement. And I think, you know, that's what we need to focus on in terms of the people we work with in the Labour Party and everyone else who wants to see a fight against austerity and see a fight around the climate, is how do we get people out on the streets collectively together and showing that, you know, if they come for Corbyn, they're coming for us as well.
Well, just briefly to echo points that the previous speaker has made, additional things that Jeremy could be doing, speaking out against corporate domination of the global economic system, all these things to be spoken openly and publicly about, and also advocating total abolition of the austerity programme, reconstruction, full reconstruction of the welfare state system, possibly or hopefully by extending taxation on the rich.
The woman with the red hair. Come on, don't worry. Yes.
Okay. I'm a left Remainer. Okay, so probably it's, but so I'm really interested in the idea that what you said, that when you said that what we should be arguing for is for the Labour Party to say don't have a second referendum, but still have freedom of leave, but have freedom of movement. Okay, and I want to know, it's just really a question, how you actually then argue that with people. I know people in my hometowns who, you know, were sort of devastated by the miners' strike. Manufacturers never really come back. The people voted for Farage, and they voted for Farage because they don't want freedom of movement. Because there's, you know, they are obviously racist and they don't want people coming in. So how do you argue with those people for a left, you know, to stay active, go out and keep freedom of movement? I don't know how you argue with those people about that.
There the money from? Yes.
Yeah, so just a couple of, I guess, insights and I guess maybe a lesson from Ireland and our experience of this argument on the island. So I'm from the SWN in Dublin, but our comrades in 2016 in the north advocated quite rightly a leave position for the arguments, same reasons that like you argued for a leave position here. And it was at this stage we made an electoral breakthrough. We had two MLAs, Eamon McCann and Jerry Carroll. The mainstream media were touting us as this new force in northern politics that wasn't nationalist or unionist, but a bit insurgent. They didn't quite know what to make of it, of us. But after making that argument, we suffered a bruising. We suffered like woeful hostility. There was an election in 2016 where Sinn Féin put up posters all over Belfast and Derry. Hard Brexit brought to you by the DUP, the Tories and People Before Profit. So they really came gunning for us. And they kept gunning and gunning in the media, and at every chance they got, rather than punching at the DUP or the Tories, they punched at us. So we suffered and we ground it out. Rather than become demoralised and rather than sink back into our operation, what we did was we went back out onto the doors and we talked about the class issues, the class issues that Mark mentioned in his talk, welfare reform, austerity, the health service, and it paid dividends. Every door in West Belfast was knocked, every door in Derry was knocked. We got involved anytime there was workplace disputes, and we made the argument around the class issues, and that allowed us space. We had an election this year, a local election, and we made another breakthrough. We increased our vote share, I think, by 250% or more. We have 3 councillors in Belfast and 2 in Derry now. But I think it goes beyond that as well, because it opened up this new political space for us, and it opened up a space where we could start to articulate a vision of what Brexit would mean for Ireland. Rather than accepting Brexit meaning a hard border, we were able to articulate a vision for a socialist Ireland, where we deal with the question of the border by smashing it with a mass movement of working class people that fight against the 2 failed states in the island. The austerity state in the south led by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and then a failed state in the north led by the compromise between the DUP and Sinn Féin. And I think that was exactly the correct position to kind of take. And I'm delighted to see that there's going to be a focus here on building with the climate movement, building for the 20th of September. But I would also say that the community, getting out, talking to working class people, engaging with them where they're at, it will pay dividends. So maybe a lesson from Ireland. Thanks.
Okay, my real concern about the discussion and really the lack of boldness by Corbyn is really what is happening to the thousands and thousands of people who joined Momentum when Corbynism was at its height. And particularly what really worries me is that such a large proportion of those people, what gave us all such hope and inspiration, was by and large, they were much younger than your average old socialist. And to be honest, I mean, I'm a recently retired teacher. I know a lot of people, mostly women, who joined Momentum as a result of Corbyn, who have to a person left now. I mean, last weekend I spent a weekend with a very close friend who was drafting her letter to Landsman after the way that he stabbed the most recent stabbing of Corbyn, about Chris Williamson. And so I think, what Mark has said about boldness, and more boldness, it was a slogan of the French Revolution, is absolutely necessary today. And I think Mark gave a very good example of what that would mean concretely over the car industry at the present time. But I think there are other austerity issues that I know every single Labour Party member, by and large, cares passionately about. Homelessness. It is a shocking disgrace, the amount of people now that we see everywhere across Britain who are homeless. What's also, there is a feminist point I want to make, that actually years ago many women were protected by legislation against homelessness. Now you see them everywhere in cities like London. And also, another issue, what about the crisis, the impending crisis that we are now facing with adult social care in Britain? It is on the point of utter collapse. Women are going to pay the cost of that in terms of their jobs and the roles that those care workers and facilities previously provided. I don't believe for one moment that if there was some lead from Corbyn or some lead from rank and file Labour Party members in every town and every city in Britain, I think that we could see serious mobilisations on the streets, because I think those are issues that the majority of people care enormously about. And I'll just end on this. When it comes to anti-Semitism, it should be a rule. We never discuss it without mentioning the question of Palestine, because that's the issue, that's the word that's being left on the agenda. So bold and more bold, and we could see a serious change in society rather than worrying about who the leader of the Labour Party is.
Hi, I'm Connor. I've been campaigning in Manchester for 3 years, and as Mark mentioned towards the end, we had a fantastic campaign around the EU elections, and it was precisely because, or the reason why we were really thrust into action with it, despite all the things going on, you know, Extinction Rebellion, all the stuff with that and so on. The reason why was because we had Britain's #1 fascist Tommy Robinson standing in the northwest of the MEP, and he had absolutely disgusting racism right there on his leaflet, but not on the front. You know, it was actually quite appealing from the front in some respects. And but what we did is we contacted all the people we knew, because we had links from Unite Against Fascism with all sorts of people in the trade union movement, in the Labour Party and so on, and we got all these activists out. It was fantastic. In Manchester, the Labour Party got, just checked it again, over 37% of the votes, and that's almost double any other party got. It's way more than double what the Brexit Party got, okay? And it's, you know, loads and loads, over 18 times, I think, what Tommy Robinson got. And that is very significant. But what we've done from that is we've been able to build a new layer of activists around standard racism. For example, I've been helping to build the Extinction Rebellion youth group at the University of Manchester and around it. And I started out by having to promote this campaign against Tommy Robinson, but then by the end of this campaign, I could do party stuff. I didn't have to push it so hard, because there were like 5 or 6 other people who were doing this at the same time. And this is like a third of the people in the room. It was fantastic. We had a joint delegation. But also, last week, a week and a half ago, I can't remember when, we had a fantastic event in Manchester's Gay Village, saying we stand up to attacks on LGBTQ plus people. You've heard about one in London with, on the gay couple on the bus. There was also an attack on a drag artist at the University of Manchester after a drag competition sponsored by the University of Manchester holds of residences. And we were able to put posters up, and it was precisely the activists, the Councillor John Connor Lyons, and all sorts of people we know, but through Stand Up to Racism, who were able to call this event, build this event, and make sure it happened. And that has really forced a generalisation on these issues. And I think it's really positive, and it's something that we really need to be doing more of. Anti-racism is something that can really cut through all this bullshit with Brexit. Yeah, and it really, if we actually fight for the position of leave or remain, we can't let the racist divide us, no to fascism, no to racism, and let in all the EU migrants, then that position will be won.
And I'll ask Mark to sum up.
Thanks, everyone. Actually, unusually for meetings on the EU, much of the debate has been about the Labour Party, so I want to address 2 things. I want to touch on the question of the EU and then touch on the question of the Labour Party. First of all, on the EU, you see, I was lucky enough to be at the Fire Brigades Union conference, and there was a remarkable guy there people may have seen about the Sea-Watch, the boat that picks up people who would drown in the Med. And the woman who was just released in Italy. And this firefighter has started volunteering, I think even on the same ship actually. And he spoke at the Stand to Racism fringe meeting that was organised. Very, very powerful, very, very moving. I mean, he told me that he served in Afghanistan, you know, so he's not someone that's come from the left. And, you know, he jumps in the water and saves people. And he is bitterly angry about it. And, you know, he says, look, I would never have said this, you know, years ago, but I'm against all borders now. All borders, because of his direct experience. The thing that struck me, though, is that in the conversation, he also said, and God, people voted for Brexit. You know, to leave the very institution that is drowning the people that he's saving. And how to explain, and it's a sharp version of a wider question to me. And the way I see it is, there's a kind of different register, isn't there? When he's thinking about the EU, he's thinking in one. When he's thinking about Brexit, he sees the face of Farage and Johnson and these people, and he hates them, rightly. And I think that how do we grapple with that? And it seems to me that partly the task of the left, and I think at points Jeremy Corbyn has begun to approach this, is to offer a completely different vision of leaving the EU. that isn't based around those anti-immigration arguments, but is based on, let's break from a neoliberal institution that in truth would be a barrier to implementing the kind of programme that in Labour's manifesto around radical renationalisation and so on and so forth. And at points, when Corbyn's talked about a people's Brexit, so you begin to get a glimpse of it, but they've been far too hesitant and not put that argument. You have to offer a radical, different vision, and like I say, and I'll come back to the comrade's point, that is unequivocally anti-racist and internationalist. Someone like this firefighter, that's a vision I think he would support, and that would boost Labour's confidence and support to pull such people around it. At the same time, I think if the left, I think we live in an era, an era, as we all know, of incredible polarisation, and including the alarming rise of the far right, which, as I say in the article in the ISJ that Despina mentioned, has got more political legitimacy now than any time since the Second World War, and within it is a harder, more defined fascist project amongst a number of the far right groups. This is very, very dangerous. If the left responds to this by saying, such is the threat of the far right, we must now defend simply what we've got, the status quo. That we defend a Hillary Clinton against a Trump, that we defend the EU against Farage and so on. I think the left will tie itself in the eyes of huge numbers of people who are going through incredible social pain generated by capitalism that's shifting the costs of the crisis it caused onto ordinary people's shoulders. It will abandon those people who are often in unclear ways railing against the establishment. If the left doesn't provide a radical alternative, then the fake siren voices of the far right, and I think that's a huge, huge danger. You have to offer a radical break with the status quo based around solidarity, redistribution of wealth, a break from the whole system that's destroying our climate and so on and so forth. And therefore I think it has to be a vision of leaving the EU that is anti-racist and says we're going to continue free movement. How do you argue for that? I think the first thing is you do actually have to make the argument. And I think that idea that there is a kind of fixed body of opinion in British society or any society that are just anti-immigrant isn't true. And actually, I think one of the great problems is when Labour abandons the defence of migrants, actually, that's when I think it weakens the resistance to those ideas inside the working class movement. And too often Labour has. And even Corbyn, I think, who is a very principled anti-racist, no question, makes concessions. Not just saying free movement, but he also says the argument that immigration, EU freedom of movement undermines wages. This simply isn't true. And the argument you have to go out and make is Polish workers or Romanian workers are not your enemy. The billionaires, 163 billionaires I think we now, these are the people the enemy. It's not someone from France or Spain or someone that's undermining the NHS. It's the way it's riddled with PFI projects, draining money out of the service, massive cuts. And you make these arguments. It's quite interesting. I don't know if people have looked at this. I mean, the support for immigration has actually increased in Britain since the EU referendum. And the reason I think it is because I think in however limited way, some of the people around the Remain camp have made this argument. And a lot of people I don't think have really been exposed. If Corbyn and the Labour Party mounted a massive campaign in defence of freedom of movement, and it's not that you win everyone, if you have a situation where it doesn't feel like there's just the only way you'll get any change is to kick downwards and attack your neighbour who's from Albania or something, if there's a vision that we're going to change society and collectively have the power to kick upwards, you restructure working class people's consciousness, especially if that's backed by mass movements that contain that embryo of possibility of real fundamental change. So you don't duck the argument, you have to take it on. The question of the Labour Party, I think there is. I think what the comrade articulated is probably quite widespread. I think there is a feeling of impasse and demoralisation and questioning, and I think something does have to change. I think the wrong response would be to say, they're attacking Corbyn, so if only we could, have a younger, more dynamic leader, then it would all be all right. There's a very good book, everyone should buy it, called The Labour Party in Marxist History. It's just had a new edition. In it, if you're not old enough to remember, there's what happened in 1983. Michael Foot, much more compromised figure than Corbyn. Corbyn's much better than Foot. It's too left-wing. That's why, that was the argument. It's too left-wing. If only we get rid of him, we have a younger, fresher face. And they did, and it was called Neil Kinnock. No, in other words, it didn't go back to the hard right. It went to the soft left. And it was a bridge not to renewing the left-wing project and defending it. It was a bridge to, ultimately, the move right that became Blair. And this was what would happen. And the real threat comes from the soft left capitulating and saying, if only we can get rid of Jeremy and have Angela Rayner, who I notice is spending a lot of time at Unison Conference, quite close to that machine. You know, all these people being touted. I think it would be a huge... The answer isn't simply carrying on, though. The argument is, it does have to be a change course. The witch hunt does have to be faced down. Labour does have to say, unequivocally, it's right to defend Palestine. It's not anti-Semitic to say it. That there is an institutionalised racist party in British politics called the Tory Party that's saturated with it. Saturated with it. And that, by the way, Margaret Hodge, my MP in Barking, I'm sorry, she pandered to the British National Party, allowing it to make its huge breakthrough. We then had to work with her to defeat them, and she made concession after concession on immigration, even in the middle of a battle against the BNP. So how dare these people lecture Corbyn about anti-racism? You have to go on the front foot. But I think I have to be honest, there is a problem here, which is the nature of the Labour Party itself is an obstacle to this. Because, you know, an insurgency lifted Corbyn to be Labour leader against all of ours and probably his expectation. An insurgency defended him and sustained him and re-elected him in the coup and in the general election. The problem is the nature of the Labour Party is it's a machine for compromise, that as a machine for containing and curbing that spirit that we saw that led to Corbyn, because it's based on Parliament above all. That means getting votes. That means the broad church, the left and the right, the pressure for unity with the Tom Watsons, even as they're stabbing you in the back. That is creating and pushes people towards that internal fight, look to elections rather than mass mobilisation. And therefore, it's a machine for containing and curbing that insurgency. That's why, as well as arguing that Corbyn must go on the front foot, and so we also have to understand the problems. And the problems lead to me to a single conclusion. The answer isn't an Angela Rayner or Rebecca Long-Bailey. The answer is that socialists, if they want to be effective, have to organise independently of the right, even independently of the trade union leaders, not in order to abstain from the struggles, but to be uncompromising in those struggles and orientated not fundamentally on Parliament, but on mass movements. And therefore my final point is, just to return to the question of the 20th of September, because, look, let's grasp this. We have had 30 years of retreats in the Labour movement. Talking about walkouts isn't a simple thing. I mean, no one should kid themselves about this. We haven't seen this for decades. It was once the norm in the working class. It's not. You know, in 2003, during the Iraq War, there were small examples of walkouts. There was a group of rail workers who went on strike. Fantastic. Fantastic, because it just points to something even beyond street demonstrations, to the kind of power that working class people have. By September the 22nd, I want everybody in this room, ideally you've participated, but you must know the names of where walked out. And you must say, look, wasn't this fantastic? Isn't this the kind of glimpse that we have to build on to build a movement that can stop climate change the political agenda in Britain, and build a kind of left that can offer a real alternative to that social pain from racism and the far right and so on. And therefore, every step forward on September the 20th is a huge investment to building the kind of alternative to the shit show of Brexit that we've talked about today.